Nestled between rolling hills and lush fields, the village of Dharmapur was a place where the scent of fresh earth mingled with the sweet aroma of jasmine flowers. The sounds of chirping birds and the hum of village life filled the air as farmers tended to their crops and children played in the dusty lanes. The village, though small, thrived on traditions that had been passed down for generations, with each person playing a role in the tight-knit community. Women wore brightly coloured saris, their faces often covered with the ends of their dupattas as they went about their daily chores. The elders sat in shaded verandas, exchanging stories and wisdom from times long past, while the younger generation listened in rapt attention, absorbing lessons of duty, honour and respect. In the heart of this village lived Meera, a young woman whose life was rooted in simplicity, but woven with the values of love, duty and sacrifice. Meera had grown up in Dharmapur with her father, an aging schoolteacher who had devoted his life to educating the children of the village, and her younger brother, Arjun, who was just beginning his studies. Meera was a quiet, graceful girl, known for her kindness and unwavering resolve. Her gentle nature endeared her to everyone she met, from the elderly women in the village who relied on her help to the young girls who admired her strength. Yet despite her nurturing spirit, Meera often felt the weight of expectations on her shoulders. Expectations not just from her family, but from a society where traditions and customs were as unmovable as the ancient banyan tree at the centre of the village. It was in the midst of this delicate balance that her life took an unexpected turn. One afternoon, as Meera helped her father prepare a simple meal in their modest home, a messenger arrived with urgent news. Her father had arranged her marriage to a man she had never met, a stranger from a neighbouring village. This was not an unusual custom, but the man in question, Raghav, was from a distant family that Meera knew little about, and the very thought of being married to someone she had never even seen filled her with dread. The wedding was to take place in a week, a decision made out of necessity, not choice. Meera's father, though loving and well-meaning, was caught in the complexities of village politics, financial hardship, and a promise he had made years ago to Raghav's family. He believed the match would secure a better future for Meera, but his heart broke as he saw the pain and uncertainty in his daughter's eyes. Her younger brother, Arjun, though protective of his sister, felt powerless in the face of such deeply rooted tradition. The tension between familial duty and personal happiness was palpable, leaving Meera torn between loyalty to her father and the overwhelming fear of her new life. As the days counted down to the wedding, Meera's heart grew heavy. She had been forced into a fate she didn't want, a future unknown and frightening, and yet, beneath the fear, there was a quiet spark of resilience. Little did she know that this marriage, though beginning in forced submission, would lead her down a path filled with unbelievable twists and challenges that would ultimately change her life and her village forever. The days leading up to Meera's wedding passed in a blur of frantic preparations. Her father, though gentle and kind, was caught in a whirlwind of village politics, making arrangements with Raghav's family. Every time Meera glanced at him, she saw the quiet sorrow behind his eyes, a reflection of his own helplessness. He truly believed this marriage was the best thing for her future, but he didn't know how to explain that to his daughter, whose heart rebelled against the idea of a life planned for her by others. In the quiet moments between the flurry of activity, Meera tried to wrestle with her feelings. She had always understood the role she was expected to play as a daughter in a traditional family. Her mother had passed away when she was young, leaving her to step into a caretaker's shoes, looking after her father and brother. She'd never questioned it. She had been taught that duty was the highest virtue, and while she dreamed of a life full of choice and agency, she also knew that her desires were secondary to the needs of her family. But this was different. This wasn't about fulfilling a duty or even ensuring her family's well-being. This was about the destruction of the life she had envisioned for herself, a life where she could someday marry for love, where her voice and opinion mattered in shaping her future. The night before the wedding, as Mira sat by the window, her mind swirling with thoughts, she overheard a conversation between her father and her uncle. Her father's voice was quiet, almost apologetic, as he explained the circumstances of the match. He spoke of Raghav's family's wealth, the promise of security, and how, given the financial pressures on the village, this union would benefit both families. Mira's heart sank as she listened. She could hear the guilt in her father's tone, and it hit her with a sense of deep injustice. He didn't know her, not truly. He didn't understand what it would cost her to live a life that wasn't hers to control. "I have no choice," her father had said, his voice full of resignation. "It's the only way to ensure a better life for her." That night, Mira cried herself to sleep. The weight of the world seemed to press down on her chest, and for the first time, she allowed herself to entertain the thought of running away. She could leave Dharmapur and start anew, build a life far away from the suffocating expectations of her family. But where would she go? How could she leave behind her father, the man who had raised her with such care, even if he was blind to her suffering? The next morning, the wedding ceremony began with a flurry of excitement and festivity. Mira felt numb, her limbs heavy with reluctance as she was draped in the traditional red sari, the symbol of a bride's devotion. She tried to hold her head high, but the weight of it all was too much to bear. Her father, standing by her side, looked at her with a mixture of pride and sorrow, unaware of the battle raging in his daughter's heart. As the ceremony progressed, the tension in the air grew thicker. Mira couldn't focus on the priest's chants or the rhythmic clapping of the women around her. Her eyes kept darting to the man seated across from her, the stranger who would soon become her husband. Raghav. He was tall, with sharp features and an air of quiet detachment. He had barely spoken to her in the few fleeting encounters they'd had, and his eyes seemed to avoid hers, as though he too was trapped in this arrangement. There was something cold about him, a distance that made her feel as if she was not even a person to him, but a commodity in an exchange. But as the ceremony reached its climax, a momentary shock jolted through Mira. Just as she was about to step forward to take the vows, the door to the hall burst open, and a figure stepped inside. An old woman, hunched and thin, her wrinkled face twisted in a permanent sneer. It was her aunt, Savita, her father's sister. Mira had never liked Savita. The woman had always been cruel in her judgments, dismissive of Mira's quiet, reserved nature. She believed women like Mira, soft-spoken and gentle, were weak, incapable of standing up for themselves. Savita's presence always made Mira feel small, like an insect under a magnifying glass. Savita had never approved of Mira's father's decisions. She believed that he was too soft on his daughter, that he had spoiled her with too much love and care. Savita had always reminded Mira that a woman's worth lay in her ability to serve, not in her dreams or desires. Her entrance now was not just a sign of her disapproval, it was an accusation. The tension in the air thickened as Savita's eyes flicked to Mira, then to her father, her lips curling into a smile that was anything but kind. "Are you sure about this?" Savita's voice was sharp, the words like daggers. "Are you certain your daughter has agreed to this marriage? Or are we making a fool of ourselves again, thinking we can control her fate?" Mira's father paled at the question, his hand trembling as he reached for Mira's. Her heart hammered in her chest, a storm of confusion and anger rising within her. She looked at Raghav, who still hadn't met her gaze. In that moment, everything felt suffocating. This was no longer a simple wedding, no longer a matter of tradition or family duty. It was a fight for her very soul, a war waged not just by Savita's cruel words, but by the traditions that had bound her in silence for far too long. The moment had come. The path ahead was dark and uncertain, but Mira knew this. She could no longer stand by and let the world decide her fate for her. Something inside her had snapped. The wedding, meant to bind her to a life of submission, would instead ignite the fire that would change everything. The weight of Mira's life in Raghav's home grew heavier with each passing day. The initial novelty of being married to a man, someone she had once hoped might come to care for her, had worn thin. The lavish house, the ornate furniture, the servants, it was all so alien to her. A girl raised in the quiet simplicity of Dharmapur. But nothing was more suffocating than the cold indifference of her husband, Raghav. His silence was a form of rejection, an unspoken declaration that he saw her as little more than an obligation, a piece of property to be endured rather than cherished. The most difficult part of this new life, though, was the ever-present shadow of Raghav's mother, Sunita. She treated Meera like a foreigner in her own home, watching her every move with scrutiny. Every minor mistake, every moment of hesitation was met with a sharp comment or a biting remark. "Are you so incompetent that you can't even make a proper cup of tea, Meera?" Sunita would snap when Meera, in her awkwardness, would serve tea that was too cold or too weak. Meera would bite her tongue, taking the verbal blows silently. She'd learned early on that fighting back would only make it worse. Sunita, after all, had the power in this house. She was the matriarch, and it was clear from the start that Meera was an outsider here, someone who had been thrust into this world against her will. The household chores, which seemed never-ending, were another battleground. The house, though large and elegant, required constant attention. Meera worked tirelessly, ensuring everything was in its place. But no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. Raghav showed no appreciation for her efforts. When he wasn't indifferent, he was outright critical. One evening, as Meera finished preparing dinner for the family, she heard Raghav's voice raised in anger as he came into the kitchen. "Why didn't you tell me you spent money on groceries again?" His voice was sharp. "I told you we didn't need anything. You've done nothing but waste money since you came here." Meera's hands shook as she put the ladle down, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I didn't spend much, just a few things to make dinner," she said softly. Raghav's face twisted with contempt. "I didn't ask you to make dinner. I didn't ask for any of this. You think you can just come in here and make decisions for this household?" The weight of his words crashed over her. She'd spent hours in the kitchen, hoping to prepare something that might ease the tension between them. But all it had earned her was more scorn. She held her ground, though, swallowing the hurt. "I'm just trying to help," she said quietly, her voice trembling but firm. "Don't!" Raghav spat. "You have no idea what you're doing. Stay out of it." And with that, he stormed out, leaving her alone with the uneaten meal. It was in moments like these that Meera felt the full extent of her isolation. The house, though grand, felt like a prison. It was a gilded cage where she was neither seen nor valued. And yet, despite the cruelty of her new family, Meera remained steadfast. She wasn't going to let this life break her. But the longer she stayed, the more she realized how much of her own spirit was being worn away by the constant attacks on her worth. Her most crushing moment came in the form of a letter she found one morning, tucked into the folds of Raghav's jacket, the same jacket she had been washing the night before. At first, Meera thought it was nothing, a piece of discarded paper, but the moment she read it, her world tilted on its axis. It was a letter from one of Raghav's creditors, a man named Rajan, who was demanding that the family pay off a large sum of money that Raghav had borrowed in secret, using the family's name. The letter wasn't just about money, it was a threat, a promise of dire consequences if the debt wasn't repaid in full within a week. Meera's hands trembled as she read the words, the ink smudging under her fingertips. The truth struck her like a blow to the chest. Raghav, the man she had married, had led her into this situation, not only by forcing her into a loveless marriage, but by deceitfully hiding the fact that the family's wealth was a facade built on loans and debts. Her entire life had been manipulated. Suddenly, everything felt like a lie. All the talk about duty and responsibility, all the promises about a secure future, none of it was real. She'd been a pawn, a mere cog in a game she had never agreed to play. But Meera, though devastated, refused to let this revelation destroy her. She knew now what she had to do, but it wasn't as simple as confronting Raghav. He was already too far gone in his arrogance and anger. Instead, Mira began to search for answers on her own. Every night, after finishing her chores and before going to bed, she would sneak into the library and pore over the books and ledgers she found hidden in Raghav's study. She learned about his business dealings, his debts, and the dangerous people he owed money to. Slowly, a plan began to form in her mind, one that didn't rely on her husband's approval or his permission. But as Mira's resolve solidified, so did the obstacles in her path. Sunita, ever watchful, began to notice her growing distance from Raghav. Her sharp eyes saw the subtle changes in Mira's behaviour, the quiet defiance, the withdrawn silence. The tension between them reached a breaking point one afternoon when Sunita cornered Mira in the hallway. "You think you can just take control of this house, don't you?" Sunita sneered, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "I can see it in your eyes, Mira. You think you're some kind of hero. You think you can save your husband. Well, you can't. You'll never be good enough for him. You'll never be good enough for this family." Mira's stomach churned with anger, but she stood her ground. "I'm not here to be good enough for anyone. I'm here to make sure that we all survive, and I will do what I need to do." Sunita's eyes flashed with fury, but she said nothing more. Instead, she retreated, leaving Mira alone, heart racing, with the weight of the challenge ahead of her. Though her immediate family had abandoned her, her father's promises now feeling like distant echoes, Mira found a small source of solace in one of the servants, Kaveri, an elderly woman who had worked in Raghav's house for years. Kaveri had always been kind to Mira, offering her small acts of comfort, a fresh batch of sweet mangoes when she was feeling low, a few whispered words of encouragement when Sunita would make a particularly cruel remark. One evening, as Mira sat on the veranda, lost in thought, Kaveri came to her with a cup of warm milk, a concerned look on her wrinkled face. "I see the pain in your eyes, Beta," she said softly, sitting beside Mira. "I see what they are doing to you, but don't let them break you. You are stronger than they think." Mira's heart swelled with gratitude. Kaveri had no power, no influence, but her words, simple, kind, and genuine, gave Mira something she had lost: hope. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that someone, anyone, cared about her. "You're not alone," Kaveri added quietly. "You're not invisible. I see you, and I know what you're going through." Mira nodded, tears stinging her eyes. For the first time since her marriage, she felt a glimmer of something more than pain. She felt seen, and she realized something crucial. Even if her husband, his mother, and the rest of his family never saw her worth, there were people out there who did. And that knowledge, however small, was enough to keep her going. But as much as Kaveri's support meant to her, Mira knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The stakes were higher than ever. Raghav's debts loomed large, and Sunita's cruelty was a constant presence in her life. Yet Mira remained determined. She would not let the lies and manipulation of her marriage define her. The time had come for her to take control, to fight for herself and her future, and to do whatever it took to break free from the suffocating grip of this family's lies. The weight of the truth came crashing down on Mira when she least expected it. She had been preparing herself for the inevitable confrontation with Raghav, the debts looming over their lives like an inescapable shadow. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened one fateful evening, when the house, her gilded prison, finally revealed its most brutal side. It all began with a knock on the door late at night. Mira, exhausted from yet another day of harsh words and empty gestures, was in her room when she heard the commotion downstairs. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, and then the unmistakable sound of raised voices. Raghav's voice, angry and desperate, mingling with a gruff stranger's voice. "Where's the money, Raghav?" The man's voice was rough, the tone edged with menace. "You think we'll wait forever?" Mira's heart raced. She knew the situation had been escalating, but hearing the creditors at the door was a reality she wasn't ready to face. She quickly rose from her bed, heart pounding in her chest. Without thinking, she rushed toward the stairs to overhear the exchange. As she stepped closer, she heard Raghav's voice crack. panic rising in his words. "I told you, I'll get it. Just give me more time." But the creditor was having none of it. "Time's up, Raghav. We gave you enough time. You either pay up or we take something of equal value." The words were like a slap, sending a chill down Mira's spine. She froze, trying to make herself invisible in the shadows, but the voice that followed would haunt her forever. "Take her," the creditor's voice barked. Mira's blood ran cold. Her? She could barely comprehend what she had just heard. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Her mind raced, but her body was paralyzed with fear. She heard Raghav's voice again, a mixture of helplessness and anger. "No, she's not part of this. She's my wife. You can't." "You didn't pay up, Raghav," the creditor said, his voice low and threatening. "You think we're going to let you off the hook for nothing? We'll take what's ours. She'll be collateral." Mira's breath hitched in her throat. Collateral. The word was a knife to her heart. She wasn't just a woman trapped in a loveless marriage. She was now a bargaining chip in a game she hadn't chosen to play. It was the ultimate betrayal, and as she listened to Raghav's panicked, helpless pleas, something inside her broke. The man who had promised to protect her, to care for her, had once again shown that he didn't see her as a partner, but as a possession, something to be used, something to be discarded when it was no longer convenient. Mira felt an overwhelming wave of despair wash over her. She sank down onto the stairs, her hands trembling as she gripped the railing. How had it come to this? How had she allowed herself to be trapped in a life she never chose? Every hope, every dream she'd once harboured felt like a cruel joke now. She wasn't a wife. She wasn't a person. She was a thing, a means to an end. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This wasn't the time for weakness. If she cried now, she would never stop. But the crushing weight of betrayal, of knowing that her life no longer belonged to her, threatened to swallow her whole. The argument downstairs grew louder. Raghav was pleading again, but his voice lacked the authority, the strength of a man who cared for his family. There was no apology, no regret in his words, only fear. Fear of losing everything, of losing her. And then, in that moment of suffocating silence, a soft voice reached her ears. "Mira?" It was Kaveri, the elderly servant, had come up the stairs to check on her, as she often did when Mira was feeling overwhelmed. She had always been a quiet presence in Mira's life, offering small moments of solace when the world seemed too harsh. Mira didn't respond immediately, too consumed by her own thoughts. But Kaveri didn't leave. The old woman knelt beside her, her frail hand resting gently on Mira's. "Don't listen to them, Beta. You are not for sale," Kaveri said, her voice a soft whisper, but firm with a strength that belied her age. "You're worth more than all their debts, all their games." Mira glanced up at her, the words sinking in slowly. It was as though Kaveri's simple presence was a lifeline, one that pulled her out of the abyss, even if just for a moment. "You are not for sale." It was a reminder that no matter how low she had been brought, she still had worth. But even as the words of comfort echoed in her mind, Mira knew the truth. This moment would not last. The creditor would take her, just as they had threatened, and Raghav, despite his empty pleas, would never be able to stop them. She was just a woman in a world built for men, and in this moment, she was powerless. She had nothing. As the footsteps grew louder and the voices grew harsher, a spark of clarity ignited within her. It wasn't a loud realization, it wasn't even a fully formed plan, but a single thought threaded its way through her fogged mind. "I can fight back." Mira wiped her tears away, suddenly aware that this was her last chance. If she didn't act now, she would be lost forever. She had no family to turn to. She had no support, but she still had her mind, her strength, and her will. She stood up abruptly, brushing past Kaveri, who looked at her in quiet concern. Mira didn't look back. She knew what she had to do. In the distance, she heard the creditor's voice again, demanding that Raghav get his house in order before things got worse. But Mira was already moving. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a way out. But for the first time, she realized that her survival wasn't something that would come from anyone else's mercy. It would come from her. And no matter how deep the despair, how suffocating the fear, she wasn't going to let this life claim her without a fight. The turning point had come, quiet, small, and yet undeniable. A hint of hope, fleeting as it was, had found a place in her heart, and it was enough to give her the strength to move forward. The night of the creditor's threat was the tipping point for Mira. The suffocating weight of her marriage, the crushing realization of betrayal, and the ever-present cruelty of Raghav and his family had driven her to the edge. But that night, something in her snapped. The old Mira, the hopeful, kind-hearted girl from Dharmapur, had been buried under the weight of her circumstances. But now, in the face of real danger, she was beginning to see a different version of herself, a stronger version, one who was capable of standing up for herself. Mira knew there was no going back. Rakaf's pleading, his selfish desperation to keep up appearances, no longer mattered. His actions had already shown her that he would not protect her, not now, not ever. And as for Sunita, his mother, the woman who had so ruthlessly mocked her and belittled her at every turn, she was nothing more than a figurehead in a house built on lies. As the night stretched on, Mira's mind worked swiftly, formulating a plan in the deep recesses of her thoughts. She would not be a pawn any longer. She had learned enough about Raghav's business dealings, enough to understand that there were dangerous people involved, people who wouldn't hesitate to destroy everything to collect on the debt. But they didn't know her. They didn't know the extent to which she would go to protect herself. The plan came together in the stillness of that dark night. She would take control of her destiny, even if it meant walking away from everything she had once known. Mira gathered what little she could, stuffing clothes and money she had managed to squirrel away into a small satchel. She would leave that night, before anyone realized she was gone. She didn't know where she would go yet, maybe back to Dharmapur, to her childhood home, or maybe somewhere else entirely. But what mattered was that she would leave, and she would never come back. The decision was made, but as she stood up from her bed, preparing to leave the room and head toward the door, she heard something that made her stop in her tracks. Raghav's voice, but this time it wasn't filled with anger or arrogance. It was a broken whisper. "Mira, where are you going?" She turned, finding her husband standing in the doorway of their room, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion. He looked like a man at the end of his rope, someone who had finally seen the consequences of his own actions. But Mira didn't feel sorry for him anymore. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "I'm done, Raghav." He blinked, his eyes wide with confusion. "Done? What do you mean? You can't just leave. This is our life, Mira. You can't just walk away from everything." "I already have," Mira replied coldly. "You and your debts, your lies. This isn't my life. I'm not your pawn anymore." For a long moment, Raghav didn't speak. His lips parted as if he were about to say something, maybe plead with her, maybe try to explain himself. But the silence stretched out painfully, and Mira knew that whatever words he could offer were meaningless now. "Mira," he said softly, his voice almost pleading, "please, I'm sorry. I should have treated you better. But She held up a hand, stopping him before he could finish. "Don't. You've shown me who you really are, Raghav, and I don't need your apologies. I need my life back. I need my freedom." Without another word, Mira turned and walked out of the room. She didn't look back, not even once. The house felt strangely silent as she made her way through the corridors, her footsteps echoing off the marble floors. But just as she reached the front door, a voice stopped her again. This time, it was Sunita, Raghav's mother. The venom in her tone was unmistakable. "So you finally decided to leave?" Sunita sneered, her arms crossed over her chest as she stood at the entrance. "You think you can just walk away from all this? You think anyone will take you in?" Mira stopped, but she didn't turn around. She could feel the weight of Sunita's gaze, sharp and full of disdain. But she didn't flinch. "I'm not running away, Sunita," Meera said quietly, her voice clear and resolute. "I'm taking control. I'm done with this life, and I don't need anyone's permission." For a long moment, Sunita remained silent. But then, in a move that stunned Meera, Sunita spoke again, her voice softer, almost resigned. "You were never good enough for this family," Sunita said, though the edge in her voice had dulled. "But you are strong, Meera. I'll give you that." Meera turned at this, meeting Sunita's gaze for the first time in a long while. The woman who had made her life a living hell had just given her something unexpected, respect, even if it was begrudging. But Meera knew that respect didn't change anything. It didn't change the fact that she had been used, discarded, and mistreated. It didn't change the fact that she needed to leave. The door was open, and the cool night air beckoned. Meera stepped out, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. As she walked away from the house, the weight of the past began to lift from her shoulders. The cool night air felt fresh, like a new beginning. Meera wasn't running from her problems. She was walking toward a new life, one she could build on her own terms. She had no idea how she was going to survive, where she would go, or what the future held. But she knew one thing: she was free. And in that freedom, she found something she hadn't had in a long time: hope. Hours later, as Meera sat in a small roadside cafe, sipping tea, her heart still racing, she received a surprising message. It was from Kaveri, the elderly servant who had always shown her kindness. The message was short, but it carried a weight that took Meera by surprise. "I've spoken to someone," Kaveri wrote. "A man who can help you. I don't know the details, but trust me, he can change everything." Meera's pulse quickened. Could this be the help she had been hoping for? Could Kaveri have found someone who could offer her the protection and support she desperately needed? In that moment, as Meera read the message, the first real sense of security, something beyond mere survival, began to take root in her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she believed that the worst was behind her. Her life, her choices, were finally in her hands, and that was enough to keep her moving forward, one step at a time. In the weeks following her escape from Raghav's house, Meera found a quiet but resolute peace in her new life. The road ahead was not without challenges, but every small step forward filled her with the strength she had once thought was gone forever. She travelled first to Dharmapur, where she was warmly welcomed by her family, despite their earlier disapproval. Her father, seeing the determination in her eyes, offered his support without reservation. But Meera soon realised that staying in her childhood home wasn't enough for her. She'd outgrown it, just as she had outgrown the life that had been forced upon her in Raghav's house. Driven by a desire to truly build her own future, she moved to the nearest city, where she found work as a seamstress. The craft she had learned from her mother became a source of both income and pride, as she poured her heart into every stitch, turning simple fabrics into works of art. Slowly, she built a small business, taking on apprentices and creating a community of women who, like her, sought independence and dignity. In time, Meera became not only financially independent, but also emotionally strong. She found friends who saw her for who she truly was, a woman with intelligence, kindness, and resilience. Though she had once been broken by the weight of her circumstances, she now stood tall, unbowed by her past. Her life took another unexpected turn when she met Arjun, a young man who had been a customer at her shop. Unlike Raghav, Arjun was kind, respectful, and genuinely interested in her as a person. He listened to her stories, shared his own dreams, and encouraged her at every turn. In him, Meera found not just a romantic partner, but a true companion, someone who believed in her strength and independence. They married quietly, with no fanfare, but surrounded by a community of friends who had supported her along the way. Arjun never sought to control her or dictate her choices. Instead, he loved her as an equal and admired her for the courage it had taken to forge her own path. Meanwhile, life for Raghav and his family took a darker turn. Sunita, still entrenched in her illusions of power, found herself increasingly isolated as the family's wealth crumbled. With Raghav's debts mounting and creditors closing in, they had no choice but to sell off their property. The house that had once felt like a fortress now became a symbol of their downfall. Raghav, despite his many attempts to salvage the situation, could not undo the damage his greed and negligence had caused. In a final bitter twist of fate, the creditors who had once threatened Meera came back, not for her, but for everything the family had owned. Raghav, broken and humiliated, was forced to leave the city in disgrace. Sunita, too, was left to confront the consequences of her cruelty. She had never truly understood the strength of the woman she had tried to break, and now, as the family she had tried to control was dismantled, she was left to grapple with the emptiness of her own pride. For Meera, the justice that came so late was not one she had sought or needed. The true victory was the life she had built, the woman she had become, someone who had turned her hardship into strength. She no longer sought revenge or validation from those who had wronged her. Her peace came from within, and that was enough. The moral of Meera's journey was simple, yet profound. True strength lies in the ability to rise after being broken, to walk away from the past and build a future with resilience and kindness. No matter how dark the path may seem, the light at the end of the tunnel comes from within. In the end, good always triumphs, not through revenge, but through the quiet power of personal transformation. In Meera's story, we're reminded that hardship does not define us, it refines us, and though we may face adversity, it is our response to those trials that shapes our destiny. As the old saying goes, what is meant for you will never miss you, and what misses you was never meant for you. For Meera, the life she built was everything she'd ever deserved, and more. Meera's journey is a powerful reminder that no matter how deep the wounds of the past, we all have the strength to rise and rebuild. Her story shows that true resilience doesn't lie in revenge or bitterness, but in the quiet courage to move forward and embrace our own worth. What about you? Have you ever faced a difficult situation that seemed impossible to overcome? How did you find the strength to keep going? We'd love to hear your thoughts, reflections, and stories in the comments below. If Meera's story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and spread the message. Let's create a community where we lift each other up and share the lessons that help us grow stronger together. Wherever you are watching from, your story matters. Join the conversation and let's continue to inspire one another.